All right, everyone. Welcome. Um, this is the first installment of our Tisch Institute Chalk Talk series for fall 2020. We're batting leadoff, and so hopefully we can do our job and start out strong and whet everybody's appetite for all the rest of the great content that we have coming your way the rest of the semester. I see a lot of names here in the attendees list that I do recognize, but for those of you that may be new, my name is Dr. Ted Hayduck. I'm an assistant professor here at the Tisch Institute. I do lots of work in the areas of economics and the trends relating to innovation and entrepreneurship in the sport sector. And so at the micro level, that's asking questions like, why do some startups fail and others succeed? But then at the macro level, thinking about what are the true innovation opportunities for firms in this sector. With me today, I have Lloyd Danzig, who wears many hats, and I'm going to let him introduce himself in a minute. But just real quick, I want to give an overview of where we're headed for the next hour or so. In the first section, Lloyd and I are going to have a conversation about some of the main concepts related to, what is machine learning and artificial intelligence, what is its role in sports betting, and then some of the bleeding edge trends as far as the unique opportunities that are available at the intersection of those two areas. And then in the second section, which I'm excited for especially, Lloyd's going to take over, and he's actually going to walk you guys through a fairly basic simulation or a model that you can actually take home and start working on and tinkering with on your own, so that you'll have something tangible to walk away from today with. So without further ado, I want to kick it back out to Lloyd, and he can give you a little bit of an overview of his background and his expertise and all that good stuff.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Professor Hayduck. This has been a while, in the making. You and I were first connected in the context of a startup that is a client of mine, FanVest Wagering Exchange, and they're, a stock market for sports kind of company. And a lot of what they do really aligns with some of what you're interested in, why do startups, some fail, some succeed, and all of that stuff. And to that end, one of the hats that I wear that's relevant here, I'm the founder and CEO of Sharp Alpha Advisors, which is a consulting and advisory firm that specializes in sports betting startups, venture capital, M&A, and technology. And I also, in an almost totally separate life, although it intersects very much here, I'm also very involved in the ethical development of artificial intelligence. So to that end, I run a 501c3. We go by the name of ICED AI, stands for the International Consortium for the Ethical Development of Artificial Intelligence. And I also sit on a number of other AI governance and ethics best practices, councils, and committees and things like that. So I end up doing a bunch of other stuff in both the AI and the sports gaming, sports betting, sports tech fields, but the intersection of those is really probably what differentiates me most in terms of my expertise. And that's why I think I'm excited for this conversation, because there are a lot of really compelling and interesting applications of AI and machine learning in the ever-evolving sports betting space. And there are a lot of really interesting things about AI, machine learning, and predictive analytics in the sports world in general that are all around us as sports fans every day, but some of which we might not be quite as privy to if we're not paying attention.
That's right. They're kind of hidden in our daily lives, right?
Absolutely.
So one of the things that I want to do real quick is start at the beginning. And I'm curious to see if you could give us an overview of definitionally, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about predictive analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning? Are they similar? Are they different? Where do they overlap? All that kind of stuff.
Got it. So this is a great starting point, because there is confusion and conflation and deliberate misuse of terminology, even in the most sophisticated corners of the engineering world. So predictive analytics, I'll start with that. Predictive analytics is just the term for any framework that utilizes historical data to make predictions, hence the name, about the future. So that is really just more about the approach, and regression techniques, of which there are many different varieties and subflavors, have generally been the bulk of what makes up predictive analytics. More recently, machine learning is another framework, a different type of framework that can also be used to affect predictive analytical tasks. So predictive analytics is just the concept of using historical data to project into the future. To explain the difference between machine learning and AI, I like to first start with the definition of just automation, because AI is really a subset of automation, and machine learning is really a subset of AI. So the way I like to describe automation is that automation is nothing more than processing according to pre-programmed rules. So any robotic assembly line that puts together cars or microwaves or smaller robots even would be automation. There's nothing human about it. There's nothing intelligent about it. There's nothing iterative or adaptive, but it follows pre-programmed rules. And many people will sometimes say something like, oh, McDonald's has a hamburger flipping robot, and they'll call that AI. Almost certainly it is not. It is just an automated process that follows pre-programmed steps. Artificial intelligence right now is best defined as processing according to pre-programmed rules in ways that mimic human abilities. So the speech-to-text functionality on your cell phone or your favorite Alexa-enabled device is probably a great example of this. It's only using pre-programmed rules, but in ways that make it feel like the thing can hear or speak, which are generally, human-type characteristics. And when I say this, sometimes people get confused because they hear AI, they think of Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Terminator, and that is just a totally different thing. And that is actually because the types of AI that exist today, we call narrow artificial intelligence, or narrow AI, or even artificial narrow intelligence, which are programs that are programmed to do one specific thing and get really, really good at doing only that. And that compares to AGI, or artificial general intelligence, which describes the class of machines that can be taught one skill and extrapolate that out to learn others and interact with the world just as humans do across all dimensions. So that is, in current formation, AI has much more narrow approaches. Machine learning, just to kind of build on this here, is processing according to pre-programmed rules in ways that mimic human abilities and allow for iterative improvement. So I think the best example that we experience all the time is the spam classifier on our favorite email clients. You download Gmail and it comes preloaded with algorithmic rules that tell it how to divert certain messages to or away from your inbox. But as you indicate that certain messages were correctly or incorrectly sorted, it adaptively and iteratively gets better insofar as your particular needs are concerned. And so I think that is a good, helpful way, and won't get into it now, but deep learning is then a subset even nested further within machine learning.
Right, and so there's lots of really great resources that can help folks differentiate these different sets and subsets and subsets. But at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of disagreements, and in some cases I've even seen people get offended, right? If you tell a machine learning engineer, well, you're really just doing statistics, aren't you? And then so it can really breed a lot of debate and discussion, very spirited debate and discussion. But I think over time those delineations will become more crystallized. So with respect to the fact that these things are they're related and similar, but they're also distinct in other ways. We see lots of startups in the VC world, and they sort of slap the term AI on their products. We're AI for food delivery, we're AI for music recommendations, we're AI for whatever, the AI powered this and that. And the next thing you know, they've secured a multi-million-dollar round of funding. How can you tell the difference between the marketed AI versus a product that is legitimate in that space?
Yeah, so first of all, let me just emphasize how much of a problem I think the phenomenon that you're describing really is. I frequently make a joke that all you need to do to raise $100 million is choose an industry that's growing or really just not in decline, and say that you have an AI-powered blockchain solution for all of their problems, and people will hand you blank checks because they don't even know what that means, but they seem to think they want it because everyone else is doing it.
Right.
But much more seriously, and from a data-driven perspective, there have been a ton of studies done on this. There was one that showed that 40% of businesses that claim to be AI startups offer no evidence whatsoever that AI is material to the execution of their value proposition. There was another where 72% of respondents claim to confidently understand AI, only to be contradicted in all of their subsequent answers to that exact survey. And I think there was a third where 34% of people said that they had interacted with an AI product in the last year, but then when their behaviors were looked at, it was actually like 84%. So this is a very widespread problem that is compounded by how hot and sexy it is to talk about AI and have something that's AI powered. I think the problem is there are many different, there are really three, but there are different varieties of the type of trickery that you're talking about. The most egregious, the easiest to condemn, is what I liken to a 21st century version of the Mechanical Turk. So before the Mechanical Turk gave rise to the name of Amazon's, crowd working platform, it was a chess playing machine in the 17th century that toured around the world and played against Napoleon and Benjamin Franklin, and purported to be a chess playing machine that could understand what the player was doing and robotically move an arm to move a piece in a strategically maximizing way. And of course, all that actually happened is it held a compartment where a real chess master could sit inside and move the chess pieces. And AI is not at all a specific industry that is susceptible to this. Theranos is probably the most famous version of this from the HBO documentary Out for Blood and the book before it, where they, similar to the Mechanical Turk situation, said we have this amazing latest and greatest technology that we can offer you, but really inside it was the industry standard and was not an improvement at all. So we see this all the time in AI startups and even in later stage companies where they literally are just lying. It is a straight up lie. They say we are using AI and machine learning and they're not even making an effort. Or maybe they tried and failed, but decided that it sounds good in our marketing materials anyway. So when you detect that and when you find that, it's easy to condemn. It's obviously incorrect. A general trademark would be a company that has not a single technical person, in their founding team or even any experienced developers, and yet is claiming to be able to offer these, enterprise type solutions. But what might be more interesting, or at least more nuanced, is some of the other flavors of this type of deception. So one would be, you mentioned AI-powered food delivery, for example. Well, there are, I don't know if there actually are in the food delivery space, but imagine an AI-powered food delivery company that actually only uses AI to optimize the speed with which its website loads or something like that.
Right.
They are AI-powered and they are a food delivery company, but clearly the AI powering has nothing to do with their ability to deliver you food, which is kind of what the implication pretty obviously is. And so that is another common form. And it's obviously harder to detect, especially if you don't know much about AI and you don't have, insight into their system. And then an even more subtle variety would be people who are using AI, who are using it in a sphere that would, in theory, enhance their value proposition, but that actually a basic, cheaper, easier, simpler, non-AI technique like basic linear regression would offer the same, if not better results at a more favorable price point to shareholders and people like that. So as you move along this spectrum, it's much, much harder to get the type of information you would need to make an assessment like that. How would you ever know that a company, unless you're really looking under the hood, is using a neural network in a place where basic linear regression would do just as well? That's not an easy assessment to make. In general, there are some questions that are always helpful. If someone shows you a product, you should ask, can I run this using my own data? Can I run this in a live environment? To go back to the Theranos example, they would famously have people come in, get their blood tested, walk off to the cafeteria, and leave sight of their blood sample so that it could be switched out. And you don't want to lose sight of your blood sample, so to speak. So looking at founding teams, their experience, looking at what jobs they're hiring for and whether they're requiring the right skills, these are all some kind of guerrilla tactics I think you can take, but the reality is many of these, particularly for non-technical, non-sophisticated people, even if you're a sophisticated investor, a venture capitalist, you might not necessarily have the wherewithal, especially in a 30-minute meeting, to make these kind of assessments. So there's a lot of work being done talking about AI standards, something called explainable AI. There's definitely a lot of stuff in the works, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are regulations or ubiquitously adhered to standards in the near to medium future. But for now, it is a bit of the Wild West, and we're not here to talk about blockchain or anything like that, but there is something similar going on in that adjacent space.
So it seems like a lot of the gaps, right, between actually implementing AI for a tangible value proposition versus, the marketing hype. Some of that is strategic. Some of that's pretty much borderline ethical, right, which is an area that you work in. And we have a great question here from Len, who's a faculty member. And he's curious about, should there be a minimum age use type of standard with respect to, using this technology for sports betting, which we'll talk about sports betting next here in just a couple minutes. But is there an ethical thing to consider there? And especially when you think about, right, the University of Colorado today just announcing that they have struck up a partnership with the sports book.
Yeah, let me take the second part of that first just to make a comment. What's really interesting that's happening, yes, Colorado University was just the first NCAA program to sign a sportsbook partnership with PointsBet. If you just step back for a second, look at the news, even from the last week, Michael Jordan is now on the board of DraftKings. Devin Hester is working with PointsBet. PointsBet's working with NBC. I mean, there are a whole host of deals that involve a much more intertwined integration of betting, information, messaging, logos into kind of the mainstream media and discourse. And ironically, that is happening while in Europe, whose individual constituent countries have sports betting markets that are 10, 15, 20 years ahead of ours, they're moving in the opposite direction. La Liga just banned gambling companies from sponsoring team kits. I think the EPL is considering that or recently did it. Italy has a nationwide ban on advertising for gambling for the whole country 24 hours a day. I think England has various restrictions on advertising during games. So there is a debate going on right now. Some say, ignorant Americans who think that they can somehow do something that other markets can't and are only going to fall victim to the same issues as others have. Other people say, no. There is a fundamentally different socio-cultural and political climate around gambling, and it is more normalized and embedded in our social lives. And when you combine that with a more robust regulatory structure that we in the US can have gambling advertising everywhere without worrying about consumer protections. I'm sure the answer is somewhere in the middle, but it really remains to be seen. To go to the first question, I think it would be really, really hard to specify, any sort of age requirement for using predictive analytics for sports betting, because it is so hard to differentiate building a model to bet on a game versus just to decide who might win versus to make a fantasy football, decision, which of course, especially if there's no money involved, there's not an age requirement for. So I think, I'm not an attorney or a regulator. I think what should happen is that sports betting, and certainly right now, at least in the US, should have very strict, KYC AML controls to make sure that no one can actually place those bets. Ultimately, I think it would not be feasible to really try to prevent someone from building models for sports betting when there is no way to differentiate. And I would also say, maybe a devil's advocate would say, well, maybe younger kids should somehow build models, but, not consider the point spread or not consider the odds or things like that. And I definitely understand the intuition for that. But what's tough is that it's pretty widely proven that betting markets with significant liquidity are the best predictors of any outcomes, sports, political, or otherwise, that we have. And to deprive someone who's interested in predictive analytics of that would be tough. So The answer to the question is it's all a hairy and evolving situation. Consumer protections are very, very important, and the lack of them in the UK, for example, led to a situation that was not only bad for consumers, but also bad for business. So everyone from DraftKings on down should be invested in sustainable gaming behaviors. It really behooves everyone to not have negative headlines and all these things. So not a direct answer, but a very interesting question with a lot of interesting implications.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in this first section here, we have just about like 12 or 13 minutes left. So I want to switch gears. Now that we've sort of dabbled into the sports betting arena, I'm curious to get your take on this. It seems like if you read what the industry experts are saying, they're pretty certain that this sector is going to be experiencing exponential growth over the next decade, maybe next couple decades. But they're a little uncertain with respect to the direction and the timing and some of the more nuanced features of that growth. So I'm curious to get your thoughts and maybe offer some of your predictions about how this market will continue to evolve and grow.
Yeah, no, I think this is an interesting and important question. So first of all, take the first part about everyone, pretty much agreeing about the exponential growth. They do agree, although they sometimes disagree on the extent or the magnitude. Sports betting revenue for all the sports betting companies in 2019 in the US was about $1 billion, about $1 billion. Morgan Stanley says that by 2025, that'll be $8.5 billion. Jefferies says it'll be twice that. And Goldman Sachs says by 2033, I think that'll be in the $20 or $30 billion range. So everyone agrees that the growth is massive. But what is unclear is the timing of that growth, the nature of that growth, who will supply it, and what will drive it. And especially if you or a lot of your students are interested in startups, Peter Thiel's favorite thing to talk about is you should consider, what do you believe that no one else does, or that the market doesn't believe, if anyone has read 0 to 1 or any of his other stuff. And where I find myself in that landscape is many people look at other gaming markets, other sports betting markets, particularly in English-speaking countries, and assume that our market will progress in similar fashion. And in fact, some of the models for the size of the total addressable market for the future years are simply taken by looking at how many people will have access to sports betting, and in comparable countries, what does sports betting represent as a percentage of consumption, and then sort of extrapolating that out to the US. Now, what I think is really missing, DraftKings is doing great, FanDuel is doing great, all these guys are doing great, billions of dollars of wealth has been created. And yet, there really is not a single offering that truly captures what we here in the US do when it comes to sports betting, which is betting socially, with friends, among friends, at the bar, through text message, group chat, WhatsApp, GroupMe, talking about it on Twitter, being just as happy sometimes to post a screenshot of a really bad loss as a really bad win, where the actual odds you are getting and the risk-adjusted return are nice and important, but are certainly secondary to the experience. The AGA, the American Gaming Association, just came out with a study, I think today. They show that 75% of NFL bettors bet either casually among friends or in work pools and things like that, not at sports books, whether legal or illegal. And when you think about the type of things that you like to bet on, I have a really close friend, one of my best friends from college. We've never lived in the same city, but he'll text me sometimes and say, hey, I'm about to get on a flight, $100, am I in an odd or even row right now? And I'll guess, and then he'll take a picture of his boarding pass and we'll Venmo each other. And those types of experiences, you watch a video on Instagram of everyone at a sports bar betting on some random player prop and going crazy when it hits, even though it had nothing to do with the game. And those are the types of experiences that people enjoy having. And yet that is totally absent from the product offering. And it's weird when you compare it with other industries that are media and tech driven. Todd Furman, who is a Fox sports betting analyst, put out a poll a couple days ago. He asked just a bunch of people, his followers, what is the main factor you consider when signing up for a legal sports book? And what none of the answers were, what answer was not there was, which sports book do my friends sign up for? And it's not because Todd made a mistake, it's because that is utterly irrelevant right now. And that just seems strange. These companies are spending crazy amounts of money on customer acquisition, and yet don't necessarily have a way to retain those customers. If there are economics students, in the class, the sports betting industry is one with a high availability of substitute products and negative switching costs, because you get a $500 bonus when you sign up for DraftKings. If you want to then place another bet at DraftKings, you have to forfeit the opportunity cost of not taking the FanDuel $500 deposit. So DraftKings better offer you a pretty damn good experience to get you to be a loyal customer to them. And what I think we've seen, and perhaps what the success of Barstool Sports in their valuation is indicative of, is that, what our friends do, especially when relates to the social nature of our sports betting, is very important. And a great data point that I like to point people to when they are hesitant or dubious is, if you go to a William Hill betting parlor in the nicest part of London, it's like an off-track betting parlor at best, like a moderately nice Chase ATM vestibule, kind of. It is transactional in nature, absolutely. You go to a sports book, even one far off the Vegas Strip, and it's a bachelor party destination, and it's a place to socialize and have fun. And I think, excuse me, that just shows a fundamental difference socioculturally in what we have here in the US. So what I would expect to see, and what will really drive a ton of innovation and a ton of value and a ton of differentiation over the coming years are, first of all, you're going to see a ton of products that bring the social element in, whether that's platforms for watch parties with people that are betting on the same thing as you, whether that's a social network for you and your friends to post all of your bets and see who is more successful, or whether that, maybe DraftKings issues a share a bet feature so that I can share a bet with all my friends and they can quickly use it. The other thing that is sort of on that note, adjacent to how social we are with our betting, celebrities in the United States are a very unique phenomenon. There really are not things that are quite that equivalent. This idea of influencers and celebrity personalities, across industries is, especially in its extremity, a somewhat uniquely American thing. And the reason that Goldman Sachs says that the Barstool Sportsbook is worth $4.5 billion, despite not existing yet, is because in an industry where the cost of customer acquisition is enormous and retention is difficult, they're just going to put up an ad that says, here's Dave Portnoy's pick of the day. Do you want to tail it or fade it with one click? And a ton of people are definitely going to do that. And you'll see DraftKings try to respond. They don't have any in-house personalities, but they have over $1 billion in cash, so they can have Kevin Hart's parlay of the day. Do you want to tail it or fade it? And things like that. So the socialization, the gamification is another thing, Candy Crush, Fortnite, right? All these microtransaction platforms. DraftKings has made no secret of wanting to not only be a place for sports betting, but for betting on everything and for eventually, more of a platform. So you will see consolidation. You will be able to watch a game on the same platform that you place your bet, do your research, and talk to your friends. But for me, what's the most interesting is the product innovations that layer in the social element that is fundamental to how we all bet here in the US, but is missing from the current product mix.
I think that's a great way to summarize it, right? When you think about, how immersive content and entertainment is needing to be, right? Especially now, even without this huge shift in the market over the past year or so. That was the direction that things were trending, right? It was more immersive, more social, more shared experiences, sense of community, things like that. But now that we're all, forced to be apart, I think those sort of social opportunities are going to be super important moving forward. And like you said, one easy way to do that is to introduce that element of betting. So let's combine these two worlds now, and let's talk about, just for 3 or 4 minutes, what is an application? What are the applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence in sports betting, right? What can it help you do? What are the benefits? What kind of outcomes are you interested in?
Yeah, so I put a quick slide on this at the end of the ones I'm about to do that I think will make a little more sense then, but to do it quickly now. It depends who you are and how and what your position is. If you are a fan or a sports bettor yourself, that's an entirely different question than if you are an entrepreneur. There are some cool things to do as a fan or sports bettor. One of them that people think might be, but is not, is trying to use machine learning to, for example, figure out what to bet on the Super Bowl. And I use that as an example because betting markets are driven by supply and demand. Bets come in and the line moves. And so there's a wisdom of the crowds mentality that informs what the odds are. People always say, how is Vegas so good? How do they get the spread so close? Well, first of all, they don't. People just have a selection bias in their head for the times where they are close. And second of all, Vegas isn't the one doing it. It's the betting activity that's coming in. So it's highly unlikely that even with all the data in the world, you would really have a competitive advantage in something like the Super Bowl. But DraftKings now lets you bet on the next at bat or the next point in a tennis match. And if you have a low latency data feed and a quick model where you can predict the outcomes, that is certainly one area. And then the other is, if people are familiar with computer vision techniques, in sports, computer vision is used to track players on a field or court and do all sorts of enhanced measurements. So perhaps you want to know where down to the millimeter was every single player on average in the 30 seconds leading up to most of Messi's goals in order to try to figure something out. And so those are sort of from the fan or the bettor perspective. If you're an entrepreneur, I think the opportunities are way manyfold. Really, all you have to do to answer this question is look at other industries, media, sports entertainment, partially, things like that, social media, see where machine learning has impacted there and apply it. The sports betting technological infrastructure is a bit behind the times. So things like recommendation engines just don't really exist in sports betting yet, but they certainly will soon, where rather than us all facing the same UI when we log on to DraftKings, we're served bets and promotions based on our historical betting behavior. AI and machine learning is really pattern recognition on steroids. So all the things that a sports book has to do, like fraud prevention, KYC, AML, and all that, those are all, boosted by machine learning. And then the actual process of making odds for these matches. If you want to price, if you want to offer people odds and expose yourself to financial liability on what is the next at-bat outcome going to be, you're going to want to have some good models. And by the way, this is why DraftKings rolled out all these new features without announcing them, so that they can kind of test their feet in shallow waters without getting hit by a ton of bets. So I think, I'll list these out later, but it really comes down to the odds making and risk management aspects of the business, the bet recommendations or recommendation engines or curated content aspects of the business, and then all the back end stuff, payment processing, KYC, ML, and the like.
Fantastic. Yeah, one of the things that came to mind as you were discussing your answer there was it almost feels like this sector now is where finance was in the mid to late 70s, right? Which would have been about when Jim Simmons came in and started the quantification of that whole industry. You think that's a decent parallel to make? Are there differences?
I think that the reason it's an apt parallel, even if not a perfect one, is that there absolutely is something of a Cambrian explosion going on in the sports betting world here in the US. All of the sociocultural and political factors that impacted other markets in their growth led to, for whatever reasons, situations where the technology kind of stagnated, the analytical approaches were not that robust. Now, and especially in, I'd say, the recent 6 months or so, there are more Harvard MBAs, Wharton grads, people turning down Goldman Sachs jobs to start sports betting startups or work at DraftKings or something like that than ever before. So I think that, without relying on any one individual person, the strength in numbers of a lot of the smartest, most passionate engineers and young entrepreneurs in the US now wanting to be data scientists, product managers, back-end developers in the sports betting and sports tech space, I think absolutely you will see a huge shift. And an analogy that I sometimes use is I've been playing fantasy sports for a long time. I think I did my first fantasy baseball season on Yahoo in 2001. And obviously that was a season-long fantasy baseball league, but we didn't call it season-long fantasy baseball because there was no daily fantasy sports. And at the time, if some financial analyst was defining the total opportunity size of the fantasy sports market, they would only have been looking at season-long contests and interviewing season-long participants and totally excluding the daily fantasy. And my guess is that something similar is going to happen. I don't know what the equivalent of DFS is. I don't know what it is that doesn't exist yet. Maybe it's some of what I've mentioned. Maybe it's something with social functionality. Maybe it's the formalization of Super Bowl boxes and March Madness pools. But my guess is absolutely all these people with ingenuity and capital rushing into the space will mean there really will be a paradigm shift, and in much less time than innovation has occurred in the past.
Yeah, really, really great synopsis there. I think that's sort of shapes how exciting it is to be in the space in the current time, right? Okay, so I think we've really established a pretty solid foundation of these two worlds and their intersection. So what I want to do now is turn it over to you, have you share your screen, and then you can walk everybody through the content and the model building exercise that you have prepared for us. So without any further ado, you can take it away from here.
Yeah, great. Are you currently seeing the first slide?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Yes. Let me just make sure that we're all up and running here. All right, there we go. The slide's still up there, Professor?
Yep.
All right, great. So, yeah, this will take probably hopefully about 25 minutes or so. And what I hope, to provide in these slides I put together that I titled An Intro to Quantitative Approaches for Sports Prediction is exactly what Professor Haydock had said, which is people who are actually interested walking away with, first of all, some concrete understanding of why these models are and quantitative models are important. And more importantly, some actual step-by-step things you can do literally right now or tonight to build, the most simple possible model that actually works and you actually understand and can then make more robust and build features into. And eventually, really, this is, I think, how you get into machine learning and more sophisticated techniques. So what I'll do, just, in terms of in order, is first do a quick overview of who cares about building predictive models and why in the sports world. Very quickly talk about the current state of modeling, talk about a couple of the evolving trends, some of which we touched upon in the first part of the session, and then we'll get to actually building a model and finally touch quickly on some of the next generation data collection techniques, as well as recapping what we had just covered on the evolving role of machine learning in the sports betting space. So as relates to who cares about building predictive models in sports, the answer is basically everyone. Because sporting events produce so much data, there is virtually no stakeholder who's not interested in predictive analytics. Anyone ranging from academics to sports bettors, corporate sponsors to media companies, and really investors to team owners and general managers are using and can continue to use data science techniques to solve an increasing number of problems in the industry. As relates to the why, sports betting is an obvious application. That's why we're here, but there are many others. Player performance is one that might be of the most interest right now. Trevor Bauer, pitcher for the Cincinnati Reds, not only does he track his own biometric information 24 hours a day to optimize his sleep and exercise, but he has all of his buddies in Cincinnati wear one as well. And an industry source told me he also pays a 24-year-old kid in New York to wear one also, all as a control group for the data that he collects on himself for optimizing everything he does, when he sleeps, when he eats, etc. Load management is a term that gained a lot more popularity in recent years in the NBA and is an area where predictive analytics can really be leveraged to optimize player availability and usage across games. Most leagues and teams have jobs that you can apply for right now using predictive analytics to optimize the profit maximizing mix of ticket prices in a given stadium. And now they're actually, much to my chagrin, certainly, at least for teams like the Yankees, becoming adapted. If you try to buy Yankees tickets and demand in a certain section is high, especially for the playoffs, they raise it in real time to try to capture some of that value that currently is being captured by the secondary market. And these are all, of course, predictive analytical kind of ventures. More recently, teams have been tracking individual components of the in-stadium experience to optimize how people flow through a stadium, where concession stands are found, when various graphics and sound effects come up on the board. Everything, almost to the level that you hear about in casinos, is now being specifically engineered to achieve some optimal goal. And then in the digital space, which is obviously where we live these days, serving curated content streams and hyper-targeted marketing campaigns are pretty classic predictive analytics tasks. So with all of that, with all of the interest, with all of the progress that has been made in predictive analytics in other industries, the billions of dollars flowing into sports, the social interest and value placed on predicting winners of sporting events, one would think that there'd be a ton of low latency, high fidelity models and enterprise software solutions that solve all of this, and that the big sports books and these big companies in Vegas, they must have awesome back-end solutions for this. But rather, it's actually quite the opposite. This is a tweet from just a couple weeks ago from a prominent sports bettor showing that virtually none of the largest sports betting companies or their vendors are necessarily originating their own odds. So what he's saying here is that during halftime of a Raptors-Nets playoff game from August 19th, this offshore bookmaker in Costa Rica that everyone is rumored to copy lines from accidentally put up an incorrect line for the second half spread and then quickly corrected it. And almost every single sports book, and he lists them out here, MGM, Caesars, Bet365 that does $40 billion a year in wagers, copied the erroneous line and the subsequent correction. And he notes at the bottom he's not sure about FanDuel and DraftKings, but it wasn't even like this was an error that any person with betting knowledge could ever think was acceptable. The Raptors were 11-point favorites going into the game. The Nets were up 3 at the half. The Raptors being 3-point favorites for the second half, unless there was a big injury, makes no sense to anyone who has spent any amount of time in a sports book. And yet all of these guys posted those lines. And what that just shows is that, first of all, predicting sporting events is hard. Let's remember that compared to casino strategy, there is no true probability to be known about the outcomes or probability distributions of various events. And also that, perhaps for business reasons, even if some of these guys do have the capability of generating their own odds, they trust this offshore bookmaker in Costa Rica even more than their own models, such that they will automatically copy them without doing any QA. And so what's happening at the same time, to add even more craziness, is DraftKings, as I was mentioning, and other companies are considering, are coming out with new products that require even more robust modeling than was required of previous offerings. So here on the left, you see this is DraftKings Flash Bet product. On the left, you see the ability to bet on the outcome of the next at bat. And on the right, it's the same thing, but for a tennis match, you can bet on the outcome of a particular point. And especially when you consider the embedded delay in TV broadcasts, not to mention incremental delays caused by other media, this presents a really significant engineering challenge that right now is being solved through, let's just say, way more manual effort and human oversight than some data scientist purists might otherwise hope to believe. And to start to segue into building a model, historically, those who do originate odds, perhaps that Costa Rican bookmaker, which, by the way, the NFL just named as their official betting partner for Latin America. But historically, those who do originate odds use some form of stochastic simulation, typically a Monte Carlo simulation. And just to level set and make sure we're all on the same page here and understand what that means, imagine I asked what the probability was of rolling a 1 on a single throw of a 6-sided die. I certainly hope everyone here knows that to be 1/6, and most of you know that to be approximately 16.7%. But for the less quantitatively oriented, what we could do is take a 6-sided die and roll it maybe 100,000 times, tally up all the results, convert those to frequencies, and then say that given our sample size, we were reasonably certain that the frequency with which each outcome occurred during our trial or our simulation is indicative or predictive of the frequency with which it will occur in the future. And now, of course, none of us would want to, nor could we, roll a 6-sided die 100,000 times in uniform fashion. So fortunately, your favorite programming languages and spreadsheet programs allow you to do this many, many times very, very quickly. I put the syntax for Excel and Python up on the top right, but you can find this just with a simple Google search. And I think now we can transition to actually building a model, albeit one that, like I said, is oversimplified and thus should be considered for educational purposes only. And first, you know, the heart of any model is the data that we get. Garbage in, garbage out is the mantra, and so we need to consider where we will be getting this data from. And where we will get the data from depends on who we are and what our regulatory constraints are and what our budget is. If we are DraftKings and have $1.2 billion in cash on the balance sheet and no debt, we'll purchase the official league data feeds, which are not actually provided by the leagues, but by a very select few companies. Sport Radar typically is the one that partner with the leagues and then provide the data and event feeds, typically at a pretty steep cost. If we are a free-to-play operator, maybe we're a sports media outlet that needs all this information, but with maybe fewer latency concerns or something else, we might go with a more affordable product, a company like Sports Data IO. But neither of these two will really be relevant for anyone who's watching this presentation. One thing that might be is a service called My Sports Feeds that offers free API access to people who reach out to them and say they are using it for educational or private purposes. Another very popular tool that if anyone here who's interested in analytics is not familiar with, I highly recommend checking out, and I will show some screenshots of, is the Sports Database Query Language, SDQL, which really does not function like SQL at all, except in that you are querying databases. Syntactically, it's totally different. It is very, very simple and very, very powerful. Now, the most popular technique has to be web scraping, of course, and that is how people gather data in mass, but you can sometimes, depending on what you're doing with that data, run into issues because terms of service typically do forbid or prohibit, you know, automated web scraping and crawling like that. And then, of course, there's always good old-fashioned, you know, copy and paste, hard coding, manual collection, pen and paper. And I wanted to just discuss a couple of these before getting into our model itself. So this is the Sports Database Query Language, SDQL. It's an open source framework designed for exactly this type of research. And it's usually deployed on the data at sportsdatabase.com. It's free to sign up. Anyone can run queries there. And it really actually has given rise to a whole community of sports handicappers. They publish picks and a newsletter, all using this resource. And just to quickly show you what this looks like, what we can do is enter a command here, or a query. The query here is that line HF and P:\HFL and PP:\HFL. What that will do is return for us the results of every single MLB game that was played by a home team that was favored after they had just lost 2 games as the favorite at home. This is obviously just a random, you know, collection of things that I put together. And within a matter of seconds, you know, depending on your internet connection, you can quickly see what would your record and ROI have been betting on that pattern, either straight up or on the run line or on the over-under. What is the average odds? What was the average total? You can see other summary statistics, how many runs, walks, strikeouts, hits, extra base hits, etc. did the team get? And then you can look at every single game and even the box score for them. So this is a very popular and powerful tool to find information, and it has a betting slant embedded in it, as you can see by the fact that they report on the records betting straight up and on the run line. What I want to talk about here is not so much scraping, but where people scrape from, and I'll use an NBA example because I'm going to build a model. We will build a model for Game 6 of last year's NBA Finals in a moment. And when it comes to scraping NBA data, basketballreference.com is probably the most popular source. And realistically, all of the dash reference sites are probably some of the places where people like getting all their sports data: baseball reference, football reference, etc. And this is for 2 reasons, mainly. One is the very friendly formatting that the data is in, but also because of some communications in their terms of service that are often cited as indications of kind of permission for users like us. So there are 2 that are frequently cited. They say that copyright law is clear, that facts cannot be copyrighted, so you are free to reuse facts on this site in accordance with copyright laws. And they also point out that learning how to accumulate data is often a more valuable skill than actually analyzing it, so they encourage you as a student or professional to learn how. And because people love analyzing sports data and automating their data gathering, and because the reference sites are so popular, a quick Google search will do a lot of the work for you. If you Google basketball reference web scraper, you will see a ton of results. Almost all of them will be written in Python. There will be tutorials. There will be GitHub links. And that is one way, especially if you already have a bunch of coding and analytical experience, you know, that might be a way where you just want to copy step by step something someone else has built and then learn how to make your own. But what I did here is I just copy and pasted to avoid any conflict with any terms of service, no automated scraping whatsoever. And what I grabbed is, like I said, we're going to simulate the Game 6 matchup between the Raptors and the Golden State Warriors, Game 6 of last year's finals. So what I did is I just pulled in, it cuts off here at the 20th game. This is a list of all the games that the Warriors played last year, and you can see whether they won or lost and what the score was. And I did the same thing for the Raptors. And I put those into Excel so that we could quickly calculate some very basic summary statistics. How many points were each team scoring on average? How many points were being scored against them? And what were the standard deviations? All pretty simple so far. And what we will then do is build our Monte Carlo simulation, our simplistic one, using this data. And I like to lay it out horizontally in a way that I think is helpful. And you'll also see I rounded some of the values just in the visualization. On the back end, they are the same. So just like we had from the previous slide, we have here how many points has each team been scoring. And this was, by the way, this was all using regular season data, although we were predicting a playoff game. So what was the average number of points that each team scored during the 2018-2019 season? And what was the average number of points scored against them? And then we apply a common transformation that is intended to account for the fact that for any given team's offense, the quality of their opponent's defense will impact the likelihood with which you'd expect them to perform at any given level. So by taking the square root of the Warriors' points scored and the Raptors' points against, the fact that the Raptors on average allow fewer points than the Warriors score will reduce this total and therefore our expected points scored downward, very much in line with our intuitions. A better defense should cause an offense to score fewer points. We then want to layer in some form of variability. In this case, we'll use the standard deviation. And then we'll do really what is our only statistical calculation here, which uses the inverse of the cumulative normal distribution function. And forgetting about the jargon for a second, this in Excel is done with one function, which people call inverse norm or norm inverse. And I'll give you guys a quick refresher of, from a statistical perspective, what is actually happening here. But inverse norm takes 3 parameters. The first will be a random value between 0 and 1. The second will be the average points or the average adjusted points scored for one of our teams. And the third will be a standard deviation. And what we're doing here, just so we remember, the norm in inverse norm designates the fact that we are assuming that basketball scores follow a normal distribution. Obviously, for other sports like baseball, soccer, and hockey in particular, that would not make sense. You usually want to use something like a Poisson or a negative binomial distribution for measuring lower scoring games that cluster in that way. But we're assuming that basketball scores or individual team scores follow a normal Gaussian distribution. And you'll recall from, Stat 101 or AP statistics or whatever, that when you have a normal Gaussian distribution and you know the mean and standard deviation, you can also know how much of the data lies between, to the left or to the right of any points under the curve. And what we're doing is almost hacking or exploiting this feature, because you'll recall that norm inverse norm took 3 parameters. 2 of them are listed here, the average and the standard deviation. The first was a random value. So when I created this table and ran it the first time, the random value was 0.95234. So what that is saying is a team like the Golden State Warriors scores 111.8 adjusted points per game with a standard deviation of 12.8. When the random value of 0.95234 is fed, the computer answers us and says, how many points, no pun intended, points on the graph and points in the basketball game, fall to the left, or what number of points do 95.234% of our data fall to the left of? And since that was 133.5, that is the score that the Warriors have attained in our first simulation. And so when we do that for the Warriors and for the Raptors using a different random value, we see that, congratulations, first of all, we just simulated a basketball game and the Warriors won by a score of 133.5 to 113.8. And then just like our dice rolling example, we do this not once, but in this case, I did it 10,000 times so that you can tally up the results and convert those to frequencies. And that is basically it. You can then take these probabilities and either convert or compare them to betting odds or to any other sort of predictive purpose. Now, before I mention all the things that we didn't include in our model, I should also point out that you don't have to simulate the whole game at once. You could simulate the first half and then have a simulation that takes the first half's results as input to result in a full game. And actually, the way the really robust models are done is that they simulate every single possession. And that is generally the standard, is to build a Monte Carlo simulation that simulates each possession, and then you test the frequency of the results to gauge the probability of the winners. But our model's missing a ton of things. Home court advantage, momentum, injuries, travel/rest, even the point spread. And we don't obviously have enough time to consider even any substantial portion of these, but I'll look at home court advantage for a second because most people are familiar with it. It is generally agreed, or at least thought, to be stronger in the NBA than any of the other major sports. And there are really two main ways, although there are many, to conceptualize or quantify home court advantage. One is the historical win rate of home teams against away teams, and the other is the historical scoring margin between those teams. So again, we're using basketball reference here, copying and pasting, and they have a table that shows every single team's home and away record from the 2018 and 2019 season. And so very quickly, we can tally this up and see the record of home teams and away teams. Home teams won 729 games versus away teams 501. It's a winning percentage of 59%. And they outscored the away teams by about 2.62 points per game. So that leaves us with two options. We know, or we think we know, what the percentage probability edge is that a home team possesses over an away team, independent of all other factors. So we could simply run our Monte Carlo simulation and add that edge to the home team's probability of winning. The other option that I think is much truer to what we're doing here would be to take that incremental scoring expectation that is seen by the home teams, add that to the home team, in our case, the Golden State Warriors, before the simulation is run, and then see how that impacts the results. So we can do that very simply. We just add the 2.62 to the Warriors. You may recall that previously we expected them to score 111.8 points, and now we have added this home team advantage. And the probabilities then, once we tally them up again, shift from Golden State winning with a likelihood of just over 50% to close to 56%. And I should mention, 55.74% probability with a standard house edge is about a money line of minus 138. The Warriors opened up at home minus 160 on the money line here. So not terribly off, considering the fact that we really didn't include that much in our model at all. Now, whether we want to add more features to our Monte Carlo simulation or take an entirely different approach, we might want to build a regression model. So maybe we want to use some of the previous data sources to measure the contribution of various factors to a team's expected score. Or, like I said, we just want to map various features onto a likelihood of winning. Linear regression is what people will be most familiar with, especially multiple linear regression. But logistic regression is especially popular when modeling events that have binary outcomes, like most of the sporting events we're interested in. And then a Poisson regression, I mentioned the distribution before, is really a multiple linear regression, but one where the y variables follow a Poisson distribution, which statistically means they have the same mean and variance and a bunch of other things, but practically means they have a pretty narrow range of discrete non-negative integer values that they take on. And like I said, soccer is the classic example, hockey after, and baseball has a slightly larger spread in its distribution of scoring outcomes, but often, again, thought to best be modeled by a Poisson distribution. And for anyone who is following along or trying to do this, you will often see, and in Excel, for example, Poisson distributions are sometimes referred to as log linear Poisson regressions are often referred to as log linear regressions. I think in Excel, there is no Poisson. I think if you want to run a regression, you need to use the log linear term. And also, since I did mention this before, Poisson regressions can be generalized to negative binomial regressions, and negative binomial distributions are probably the ones people are most familiar with you know, an 80% foul shooter is going to take 10 shots. What's the likelihood he makes more than 9? Those are kind of the classic, you know, binomial distribution questions, and a negative binomial is helpful here. And I know you guys, or at least the people who are signed up for this because they're working in RSTUDIO with Professor Haydock. You know, I don't know if you guys are familiar with a package like ggplot2, but using ggplot2, you can both analyze and visualize all of these: linear regressions, logistic regressions, Poisson regressions. These are all screenshots from ggplot2 using R to do each of those types. So fortunately, they make it pretty easy to at least do a basic fitting of any of these models. It gets more complicated once you want to configure and tune some of them yourself, but at least getting started, you know, reading the documentation, if you're already familiar with R and RSTUDIO, is not all that difficult. And I know people probably want to do something that's relevant to sports and their lives, but R, you know, comes preloaded with that flower classification data set that I'm sure you guys have used to, you know, predict whether something is an iris or whatnot. And you can use that for all of this. And all of this, the machine learning packages, ggplot2, Carrot, all of them, they work, and you will find tutorials online that show you how to use the iris, the flower classification data set. I wanted to make a couple of other comments because we also want to make sure that our model is robust against overfitting and sampling bias and all these other things that come up. And there are a number of techniques, some of which borrow from the machine learning discipline and others that don't, that are very popular here. So cross-validation is especially popular in machine learning and refers to the exclusion of certain data points when building a model so that they can be used later as test cases. For example, maybe we want to exclude 10 randomly selected games from the 2018-2019 NBA season, and then we can use those games as input into our model, see what our model would have predicted, and then see how that lines up with what actually happened. Backtesting, somewhat similar, right? Just involves the running of a model on historical data, perhaps a previous season or a playoff game. Sensitivity analyses are used to gauge the degree to which outputs are changed by alterations of certain inputs. Usually, especially if you're a good data scientist, procuring additional data can be leveraged into enhancing model robustness. Tuning hyperparameters is something you hear in machine learning way more commonly than you hear outside of machine learning, but in this case might refer to, you know, I ran that simulation 10,000 times, but maybe we should have ran it 100,000 times or 1,000,000 times. And the number of times you run the simulation might be best described as a hyperparameter that you yourself, you know, can tune. And ultimately, an ensemble approach, if anyone has not heard the term, applies to either using multiple different models or one model run on multiple different data sets and hoping that they all arrive at the same conclusion, which would give you more conviction. And I think one of the best ways to summarize the need for robustness is in something called the Datasaurus Dozen, that if you haven't heard of, you should definitely Google because the website is much better than this screenshot. But the Datasaurus Dozen is a collection of 12 scatter plots plus the dinosaur at the top, so 13, that have identical X averages, Y averages, X standard deviations, Y standard deviations, and correlations, but look completely different. If you were looking only at summary statistics, and you can see them up at the top, you would think that there were 13 potentially identical data sets, and obviously this is a bit absurd to make a point, but shows that that is not true. And the types of things that you do to enhance model robustness, to enhance the explainability of your machine learning models, tend to also help fend off some of the pitfalls that you could be victim to if you don't take into account the fact that data sets can have similar statistics while looking this different. And so now just to quickly kind of cap this all off, we briefly mentioned some of the features that an ideal model would have: injuries, home court advantage, all that. And I just want to touch upon some of the next generation data points that are being collected. Wearables, you know, offer real-time analysis, increased accuracy. I used the Trevor Bauer example before. What I wanted to talk about briefly here for those interested in machine learning is computer vision. Computer vision is used all over the sports world. If you see the first down marker, that yellow line on the football field, the yellow line in the Olympic swimming pool that shows you how Michael Phelps would have been swimming if he was there, that really is all computer vision. And there's a comic here that I'll skip because I don't have much time, and I just want to show you some really cool examples from last year's MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. That this comic was a not that funny way of just reinforcing how difficult they were to attain. So anyone who's a basketball fan, or certainly anyone who watched The Last Dance during quarantine, will quickly recognize this scene as Michael Jordan taking a shot, the famous buzzer beater in Game 6 of the 1998 Finals. And what you can see here is a really impressive, high fidelity computer vision tracking system that is doing pose estimation. And despite the fact that it's being retrofitted onto old grainy footage, and that the players' bodies are sometimes overlapping and becoming intertwined, it retains a lot of accuracy. This next clip, very painful to show as a Jets fan, but we have here obviously Odell Beckham Jr. making his one-handed catch in the 2014 Sunday night game against the Dallas Cowboys that, for anyone at NYU, took place, you know, right across the river at MetLife. And aside from the freak athleticism on display here, what's really impressive from a computer vision perspective is the fact that there are so many similar pixel patterns and groups. I'll pause it here before we go to that soccer one. So many similar pixel patterns and groups. Odell's jersey is blue, his socks are blue, the defender's socks are blue. Both players are wearing almost the exact same color pants. And yet, really, the system does not lose its fidelity at almost any point. And then finally, this is from the 2018 World Cup, Germany taking a free kick, a man down against Sweden, and really showcases the ability to track multiple bodies on the same screen at the same time and to seamlessly transition between camera angles. So I hope my voice didn't get too distorted while some of those videos were showing, but just to summarize the last slide here is what I was intending to put up and show that with the growing array of available data, the increasing demands for low latency models and all that, machine learning does represent a very compelling framework for enhancing really almost every link of the sports betting value chain, even though it is not really currently being implemented at scale. And just to point those out, you know, one and probably the most commonly thought of is handicapping or odds making, where lines and odds are set via predicting event outcomes, like we just went through. Risk management, which is a little different. That's once you've set the lines and the bets start coming in and you want to look at past betting behaviors and current customers on the platform to gauge what line movements do I need to make in order to ensure that the risk minimizing proportion of wagers ends up being accepted on all selections. Recommendation engines, I mentioned, will leverage, you know, first and third party data to provide users with an optimal experience. Responsible gaming is an industry term for the suite of mechanisms by which customers are kept from the ills of addictive behaviors. I prefer the term sustainable gaming. I think it's a little friendlier to the businesses that have to spend on it and does a better job conferring the notion that preventing people from becoming addicted to gambling and preserving the integrity of underlying sports leagues is really something that benefits, you know, the whole ecosystem, not just sports betting, but sports entertainment, sports media, and all that. And then finally, fraud prevention, mostly by way of know your customer, KYC, and anti-money laundering, AML. So that concludes, you know, the slides that I prepared today. But if this stuff is of interest, you know, I publish and speak a lot on this. So whether it's on Medium, I have a bunch of interesting articles, and I also have a website, lloyddanzig.com, where I tend to, you know, store a lot of these things. And you know, whether it's Twitter or the podcast I run, these are definitely topics I'm frequently talking about at events like this, at conferences, and I think I'm pretty confident that you are going to increasingly see more and more people interested, more and more people having similar types of expertise. This expertise that I currently have becoming less and less unique and differentiated. And really, I think, you know, at the least, there's an opportunity to use the fact that you love sports to learn some cool new things about math and statistics. And at the most, there are entire, you know, lifelong careers to be had, some of the paths of which really have not at all been defined yet, that really are very much enhanced, if not enabled, by understanding predictive modeling and quantitative approaches to sports prediction. So really do appreciate, you know, everyone's time and patience. And, you know, Professor, I can turn it back to you.
Great, Lloyd. Thanks so much. I know there's, just in my own head, I've got about 20 or 30 follow-up questions to dig into, but I know that, you know, we want to maintain that time integrity that we talked about. So I will openly and emphatically encourage anyone that has an interest in this to please reach out to Lloyd, reach out to me if you're a student here, and I'm always happy to talk and connect, and I know Lloyd feels the same way. So thank you, Lloyd, for taking your time and your energy to be with us this evening, and looking forward to following up and seeing what you got cooking in the next couple of months. It might be a whole new landscape by then, who knows.
I think that's probably the case. I really appreciate it, Professor. I think this is awesome. This is a great type of event. There's a real lack of domain expertise that I hear DraftKings and FanDuel complaining about all the time. So I think it's the people who are watching this who can fill those roles, bring something new, the tech, the business, the product, and all that. So I echo what you said. I always love talking about this, particularly people with an entrepreneurial slant. You know, startups and venture capital within the sports betting space is a really, you know, an area of passion and expertise. So thanks a lot. And yeah, hope to hear from you and some of the people who are attending real soon.
Wonderful. And thanks again to everybody who attended on this first installment of our Chalk Talk series. And we will see you all again next time.
Take care.